Okay, welcome back to Context. We are joined this evening by Rob Ehsan, Sacramento native and assistant basketball coach at Stanford University. Coach, thanks for jumping on, talking us through your journey and what you've learned along the way.
I appreciate you having me. I'm excited to be here.
All right, well, let's dive right in. You have an interesting backstory, and I think it would really serve the audience to kind of know how you ended up where you are now. If you don't mind taking us through your background and how you ended up getting your first coaching job and any subsequent jobs and what it's kind of been like along the way.
Yeah, I played at UC Davis, obviously. And as a freshman at Davis, one of my assistant coaches was somebody you've had on here, Dietrich Taylor, the head coach of Cal State Fullerton. And I remember as a freshman asking Dietrich, if I want to be a college coach, what do I need to do? And he had told me that I needed to work summer camps. So keep in mind, again, this is 2001. So I go on a mission to work as many summer camps as I can while I'm in college. I grew up loving the ACC, similar growing up in Sacramento. I always dreamed about playing at North Carolina or Maryland or Duke. So in college, I had this idea. I'm going to email these schools and ask them if I could come work camp for free. So I go to, make a long story short, I go to work Maryland's camp for 3 straight years during college, the Gary Williams summer camp, regular kids camp. I get a chance to meet their coaches. They get to know me as the kid from California. I don't think anybody ever reached out and said, can I come for free to work your summer camp? So obviously that was something that stuck out. So I did that. And when I graduated from UC Davis, they had a graduate assistant position open. I actually had a job already set up to go work in San Francisco in a business consulting for Accenture, but I called them. I said, hey, listen, I got this job, but I would love to coach at Maryland, get my MBA, be a GA. I'll do whatever it takes. That would be a dream come true. I get the job. So I start off as a graduate assistant at Maryland. And coach, coming from Sacramento, walking in the first day into Gary Williams' office, it was just like a dream come true. I get chills thinking about it because it was an unbelievable situation at a young age. And I'm at Maryland for 6 years. I go from graduate assistant to assistant coach to Gary retires in May of 2011. And I was named the interim head coach at Maryland at, the age of 28 years old. And I jokingly tell everybody that my career's been on a downward spiral since that time. But they did the Maryland administration, kind of gave me that interim title for a week while they hired Mark Turgeon. So I go from there to Virginia Tech. I go to Virginia Tech as an assistant coach, work for Seth Greenberg, one of the best basketball minds really that I've ever been around. Obviously one of the best announcers, if not the best in college basketball, works for ESPN. And during that time, I got to meet Jared Haas, the Stanford head coach. And he was an assistant at North Carolina while I was at Maryland. Well, he gets the UAB job and he says, hey, would you come to UAB and be my top assistant? I'd never been to Birmingham ever in my life. I'd never really been to the South. I've been at Maryland and been at recruiting and had traveled a lot, but first time ever I stepped foot in the state of Alabama is my first day on the job into Birmingham. My wife and I moved to Birmingham. We have an unbelievable run at UAB. A year into the job, as myself as the lead recruiter, we signed the highest player in the history of UAB basketball, the number 60 second best player from Selma, Alabama, William Lee. We go on to win win the Conference USA tournament, go to the NCAA tournament, set a school record for wins, and coach gets a Stanford job. And at the age of 33, I become the head coach at UAB. Again, a humbling, almost a dream come true, almost a surreal experience for me, given where I'd come from. Again, you know me in high school, but as a young, skinny kid from Sacramento, to be able to make it to the highest levels of coaching in college basketball at that age was just an unbelievable experience, and had a great run for 4 years. You won a lot of games, did a lot of good things. And then I was Friday the 13th, it's something that sticks out, but March 13th, 2020, I was unexpectedly fired after our season, literally right before the world shut down. Mm-hmm. And then I got a chance to have a kind of a cool experience doing some things this year, really reflecting, doing some leadership stuff, working for the Pac-12 network, being on TV, and then having a chance now to come back to California as an assistant coach at Stanford, close to where all my family is from. I kind of feel like, in a lot of ways, my career's kind of come full circle and just a new, unique journey that I've been on.
Yeah, it's fascinating how you ended up where you were. And the story I always heard about this, and you can tell me whether it's true or false, but when you got to Maryland camp that first year, maybe it was the third year, Gary Williams just grabbed a guy and was like, "You're going to drive me this week." And you ended up spending a lot of time with him. That's the story I've always heard. Any truth to that?
It didn't go down exactly like that, but my last year there, it was a very unique deal. They said, "Come out and we'll interview you for the GA job." So I go out there and it's me, and they actually had another guy there. Strategically, they were interviewing. I did get a chance to spend some time with Gary. I interviewed with the staff. That was probably just as important, to be honest. Their director of ops, Troy Wainwright, kind of ran everything at Maryland behind the scenes. Made a connection with him, and 2 months later, again, they're like, "All right, you're starting in August," and I'm showing back up. I drove across country from Sacramento, my mom's house. Me and my wife, now my wife, my girlfriend at the time, we drive to Maryland, and the journey began.
Awesome. Thanks for clearing that up. I've always wondered how that story really shook out. What I want to follow up on is Hass gets the Stanford job. You get tabbed to be the new head coach at UAB, and it's your first time moving over 18 inches into the big boy chair. What did you realize very quickly that you still needed to figure out?
Everything. I don't think I can put that into one single answer. I will say that at my age, the success we had, I think everybody, my family, myself, everyone at UAB, the donors, thought I was going to be the next Brad Stevens. I mean, and I say that with a lot of humility, because I really had no idea what I was getting into. And I'll tell a unique story that kind of will share this. My very first game, coach, as a head coach, it's on my mom's birthday. My mom's there. Growing up in a single family home, my mom meant everything to me. It's just a special night, as you can imagine. And 10 minutes into the game, our starting point guard, the reigning Conference USA Scholar Athlete of the Year, tears his ACL at half court in the middle of the game, literally like the movies. So after the game, I'm going home, and Fran Fraschilla, who I did not know, but now he's become a good friend, tweets out, "Star point guard Nick Norton tears his ACL. Rob Ehsan, young coach, is going to get a real lesson in crisis management." So he puts that out there. My agent calls me that night, and I said one of the dumbest things, coach, that I said. I told my agent, I said, "Well, now if we win the league, I'll for sure be coach of the year." And I think I say that to say it was the most arrogant and dumbest and overconfident thing I'd ever thought, because I had absolutely no idea what it was like and what the challenges was going to be to run a program successfully at the level of Conference USA with all the great coaches in our league. And so I think there's so many different things, little things that, were a huge adjustment for me.
Yeah, if you don't mind, that's really, in hindsight, obviously, right? You're able to say that from a maturity standpoint, like, wow, I could have handled that differently. Wow, he probably could have handled that differently. And my response to that, I wish I had a do-over. Are there a few things that you could point out to maybe somebody that's listening that's ending up in that role? Like your senior year when I took over at El Camino, and I thought I had the answers. I was coming from Coach Williams, and you just plug and play and do this. And then all of a sudden it's like, nope, doesn't work. But are there a few things you could say, hey, if I'm in that situation again, these are the three things I got to make sure I hit?
So this one concept that I've really come to learn is working on the business versus working in the business. As an assistant, I was really good at working in the business. I was a problem solver, get stuff done. How much stuff can I handle? Just work. When I shifted over to the head coach, I still tried to do that. And I never was, and it took me a few years to really figure out this concept of I needed to be working on the business as opposed to in the business. So I think that's the biggest one thing. And if you're a good assistant, often you have those characteristics that I talked about that make you good, but they can also hurt you when you step over into that leadership role. And now you need to run a whole organization. I think, I learned that, Pete, I read this in Pete Carroll's book, that orchestrating the mentality of the team is the leader's number one job. I don't even think I knew what that meant for about the first 2 years. And so being able to drive culture, delegate, develop staff, find who I am, those are all things that I was able to discover and had to learn through and work through that I wasn't really good at or didn't really comprehend at the time.
No, for sure. Both of those make perfect sense. It's almost like when you are the assistant and you've been tasked with something. I remember Coach Williams would sit in the office and just like, hey, we need to do this. All right, Coach, I'm on it.
For sure.
It's, you accomplish that and then you move on to the next thing. But to your point, if that's how you're wired and now you got to learn how to delegate and trust somebody to get something done, you have to teach them that skill as well to get your time back, which then allows you to 10,000 foot view, create culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Figure out what you want to do in regards to that mentality you're trying to develop. And so I think those are really important for people to understand. The role shifts and so do the tasks. I'm also curious because you had a unique opportunity in the last 12 to 18 months, however long it's been, to really see that business, to really see the job from an objective perspective and being an outsider again when you've been an insider for so long. What would you say you've been able to learn in the last year that you're super excited to get back into the trenches and apply these things?
So I think the biggest thing is what I found is, and this is not just coaches, but leaders, is how great leaders are so intentional with their time. And it kind of goes back to what I said before and what you just kind of mentioned. I'm wired to work, to go, 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 go. And oftentimes we mistake, activity for productivity. And I think being intentional with your time and being able to prioritize your time and focus on things that you need, that are important to you to develop and grow, I think is one of the biggest things that I neglected and didn't really get a chance to implement as a head coach. I think the other thing is mentors. So this is a unique thing because I didn't do a great job of being intentional with mentors. And look, I have a great network. A lot of guys that have been in, Hall of Fame coaches and guys that I've worked for, guys that I've coached against. But I was never intentional about putting a group around me to really seek out and then ask them questions, and not just when you have a problem, and schedule time to pick their brain. And I think, again, because I was so on the go, 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 never stopped recruiting, right? You can always get extra shots up, trying to get guys to always stay in the gym. Don't ever leave the gym. And I never was able to take a step back. Again, I didn't do a great job of what I said, of orchestrating maybe the mentality of the team, but also focusing on becoming better myself. And I think the next time given the opportunity, I will be extremely more intentional with my time. I will be way more intentional with mentors, and also understanding, who I am and what kind of people fit me, what kind of recruits fit me, what kind of staff fits me. I think I'll be way better with my staff than I was also. And I think those three things are extremely important to any, organization, not just a basketball program, being successful.
Yeah, no, you're dead on all of those. And I think it's something as you mature and grow, until you're put in that spot where you really need to seek guidance, you don't think about it in that way, right? Like you said, I'm around great people. I can always reach out, but am I doing it in a way that is responsive rather than reactive, right? Am I trying to get better all along versus, oh, heck, I have a problem now. How do I solve it? So again, you have a unique story and you have a unique circumstances that you've been through at each of these stops, right? You mentioned Gary Williams, Greenberg, Hash, you're going back to work for him again. And you've had an opportunity to be in different programs. What would you say as the coach yourself when you were running the show, and now as you're transitioning, you're going to go, back to the West Coast, back for Coach Hash, what's the best thing that you do in your program that will go with you wherever you go because it has such a transformational impact or ripple effect on culture?
It's a good question. So I think one of the reasons we were successful at UAB was the system of work required that I had in place. I thought we did a great job of being consistent with the system of work required. Everybody works hard, especially in college basketball. So I'm not saying that we just worked hard, but we had a system, a calendar, literally all year round, of making guys work and do extra and chart it. And I think at the end of the day, we won 20 straight games essentially for the last 3 years as a head coach, which only 40 teams in Division I had done that when we do that. And then when I look back, I think that was probably the biggest thing. I think the other part that I was really intentional about, and this is my personality, is just the relationships with the guys. And I think we did a lot of different unique things to build relationships with the guys, to try to develop the guys. I mean, the best kind of unique thing is, or one of the best things is and one of my assistants came up with this at UAB, it was called oil checks or an oil change. So every 3,000 miles, 5,000 miles, whatever, your car needs an oil change, right? Doesn't matter what kind of car it is. Sometimes the better cars need an oil change more frequently. So we related this back to the players where we had staff members every 6 weeks. We called it an oil check with all of the guys. You were going to literally check in, and we had a checklist that we would write down, and you were going to go through different things, not just basketball, in their life. Because I think nowadays with the pressures that's put on these kids from social media, from the media to perform, from the coaches, it's hard to find a release. And we wanted to dive into, hey, how's your family doing? Is there anything we can help you with as coaches? Is there anything bothering you inside? To really try to touch the mental and emotional side of the players. And the oil checks was one of the best ways, kind of a unique thing that we did.
Awesome. I like that. It also sounds like, if I heard you right, you had a calendar mapping out, okay, here's practice. And then here's the extra shots you need to get. Here's the lifting you need to get. And here's how we're going to chart it. And everybody's going to see where you stand. Does that sound about right?
Yep. And we did it through the summer with, how do you get better? We set shooting goals. I mean, can guys, one summer at Virginia Tech, Eric Green, who's one of the best players I ever coached, made 20,000 shots in the summer outside of practice. We charted it. We had a system set up. And what I saw at a young age, it really started at Maryland, to be honest, but what I saw is Eric Green go from a 23% shooter to a 36 3-point shooter to the NCAA's leading scorer, a lot because of mental and confidence and mentality and work and buying into a system that we created. He was always a good shooter, but he was never consistent, and a lot of it was mental. So that was like something. So when I became a head coach, it wasn't like voluntary where I was going to get one guy and do that. I was going to do my best to make the whole program do that and have my staff be accountable to guys doing that.
Got it. Yeah, no, I think what you said there is the confidence and mentality that came from that work is something that's been shared. It gets shared every summer at PGC camps, where it's the shooting approach is like, here's my journal of all the shots I've made. This is where my confidence comes from, right? And so it's like you created that for the whole team, which is really impressive. Again, you've been at multiple places and had access to great coaches, not just in basketball, but in other sports as well, right? In the ACC, Conference USA, and now you're moving back into the Pac-12. What have you learned watching other coaches that maybe aren't basketball coaches that you've been able to steal from and apply those lessons to your basketball team?
Well, I think I've always been fascinated. Maybe it's because, playing football as a youngster, loving the 49ers, being in the state of Alabama for the last 8 years, arguably the college football capital of the country. So I've been able to, I think, experience more football coaches. And I think the biggest thing, because of the numbers in football, the head coaches are forced to delegate. They don't have a choice, really, right? So I think the organization and delegation of football coaches is something that basketball coaches could take from, and something I think I really struggled with, especially the delegating, because look, a lot of basketball coaches in the smaller groups want control, want to be able to try to control everything. I was like that to some degree as a head coach as well. And again, when you delegate, it forces you to develop. And I think learning that those two things, organization and delegation, from some of the football coaches I've been around, one of the UAB football coach, Bill Clark, is one of the best in the country. And he's a phenomenal coach. And just, learning those kind of things, I think I've taken a lot, and reading a lot of football coaches' book. Pete Carroll's book, Win Forever, was arguably the most influential, best read that I've had in the last few years.
No, absolutely. I think that's what you said about delegation is super important. And obviously you're dealing with a 100-man roster versus a 15-man roster. You got to figure out how to do things, and you got to cede some control. But it's something that, as I've moved into the athletic director role, I guess I've become more aware of how transferable many of the coaching techniques that we use are, even if the X's and O's maybe not be. And I think it's a missed opportunity often. I'm glad that you're being able to take advantage of what is the primary sport where you are currently living. How would you say, given the experience you've had and the different roles that you've had, that your approach to coaching has changed throughout your career?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think coming up for Gary Williams, so much success at Maryland, 3 years removed from the national championship. You know, he was the standard, I think, for me at a young age of this is how all coaches are. Okay. What I think then coming to a Jared, and look, Gary Williams it's no secret. He, goes crazy during games, especially, and he's extremely intense, and his teams play with a chip on his shoulder. And a lot of that is because of him and how he coaches, right? And he yells at the assistant coaches sometimes as much, if not more, as the players during the game. Well documented. So I think that was my, background in big time college basketball, had just such a strong impression on me. Then going to coach for Jared Haas, who never really will ever curse at a kid. It's just not who he is. Obviously one of the most hardest playing college basketball players, but took a total different approach with the guys, in terms of maybe the way he treated them, spoke to them, etc. And then being able to see him be successful and do it at UAB. I think what I learned is that you have to find, I don't know if this answers your question exactly, but there's so many different ways to do it. The best way to do it is your way. But I think it took me 2 years to find out who really I was in that regard. And in my first season, I was trying to be Jared Haas because he had been the head coach and we had just won and we hadn't lost a home game in like 2 years, and I'm going to keep this going. And then when we did lose a home game, I tried to be Gary Williams and kick everybody out of the locker room and run guys 3 straight mornings at 6 a.m. And it was a disaster. I mean, I literally sabotaged our first season in a lot of ways because of me trying to find out who I was. And I think my experience, and it doesn't matter what level you coach at, but until you become a head coach, you think you know what you want to be like, but it's very difficult to find out who you are until that happens. Again, I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but
it absolutely does, because I think the key takeaway that you just shared, and that I've heard shared 60 times on this thing, is authenticity matters. And as soon as you're trying to be somebody else, you may find a little success, but you're not going to reach the peak of what you're capable of because you're trying to wear somebody else's clothes, so to speak, right? And so if you're not wired to be the Gary Williams, it's not going to work. It's going to come off as phony. If you're not wired to be Jared Haas, it's not going to work. You're going to come off as phony. So I think your answer, which I would agree with, is you have to be authentic and you have to be yourself no matter what. The problem with that, in my experience, is as you're trying to prove yourself as a young coach, you feel like you have to behave a certain way until you achieve a certain level of success when you just don't care anymore and you feel like you can just be yourself. So how do you cut the line and get to that point if you haven't established, whatever success is? And I've always said I've been lucky enough that I've been around and part of some wins early on that I didn't have to worry about it. But at the same time, same growing pains that you had, and ultimately got to a place where this is how I approach things, and it's worked out. And so as you were finding yourself, were you able to settle in on, okay, here are my core values. This is what I believe in. This is how I go about it and how it's going to be the rest of my career, because I had an opportunity to really figure this out.
So I'll first touch on what you mentioned, core values. I mean, it took me, it's taken me 4 years we had some core values, but to be able to really utilize them and have them impact your program is a whole nother story. It's a whole probably podcast that we could get into, to be honest. But the way you just said what you said was exactly my situation, because I was taking over at UAB. We had won a school record games. The pressure, we had not lost a home game in 2 years. The pressure to win we played the hardest schedule in like 5 years when I first got the job. We played Kansas, Memphis, Auburn, St. Mary's. I mean, all in my first 2 months. Okay. And not only like there was pressure to win those games and I felt it. And that pressure caused me to be somebody kind of, that I really probably wasn't, which is exactly kind of what you said. But I think it's this notion and it doesn't matter. I don't know how you develop this skill, but the ability to surrender to the outcome is probably the biggest thing that I also learned in becoming myself. Because when you surrender to the outcome, then it frees you up to be yourself, to make clear decisions based on who you are, what you value, without feeling the pressure. That's very difficult to do, obviously, especially in the world of high stakes college basketball. But that's exactly what you said. It's another way to say exactly what you said. And I think it's critical.
Yeah, and it's probably something you try to teach your athletes, right? When they're shooting, it's like, hey, don't be attached to the outcome. Let's just work on the process. Eventually, we're going to get better. But in the world that you live in, you don't always have the timeline that you think you're going to have. Yeah. And so there's arbitrary metrics that don't necessarily fit the real timeline that you feel beholden to.
Yeah.
So moving from that to, is there a failure that you can point to as a transformational moment that has allowed you to grow in a way that will help you avoid being back in a similar circumstance?
Yeah, it's just Friday the 13th. I mean, I used to tell our guys, coach, that we used to have this saying, "What's your story?" And I'd put it on t-shirts and I'd tell all the guys, "What's your story?" And we'd have the guys write where they're from and read it at our retreats to the team. And I really tried to lean into this notion that everybody, all the great ones, go through some kind of huge adversity in their life. And that's why they become great. Well, I used to say this to our group, knowing in the back of my head that I really had not faced any professional adversity. I mean, I was on a linear track from the age of 22, from the GA at Maryland to the head coach at UAB and beyond. I mean, like fast, right? With never any real professional adversity until now, until March 13th, Friday the 13th. And so I think, again, we've spoken about some of them, but if everybody could, and my deal was unexpected. Obviously, when you get fired at this level, it's very public. Everybody knows, it's on ESPN and all that stuff. And there's a great deal of humility that comes with that whole experience. Now, what I'll say is, I think how I've handled it and the leadership, the learning, the self-reflecting, the growing has been arguably one of the best things that's ever happened to me, because I've now faced that adversity. I've been able to realize some of the mistakes that I've made. And I know I am 100 times better coach than I ever was before. Now, convincing an athletic director that that's the case is a little bit more challenging. But, I think of people used to tell me Pete Carroll, Bill Belichick, we're talking about football. Some of the greatest coaches, have gone through this kind of adversity and it's made them better. So I just think that, going through what I went through, and the way I went through it was the biggest failure by far. That will, I strongly believe, help me get to places, I maybe never thought I could go because of it.
Absolutely. And I would even push back a little bit and say, just because you got fired doesn't mean it was necessarily a failure, right? Because there's two types of coaches, right? Those that have been fired and those that are going to get fired. It's ultimately the opportunity that you've created from that experience is the key, right? Here's the circumstance, and how do I respond to that? And it sounds like you've dug in and done some lifting and try to figure out how to get better. So when the next opportunity comes, you're even more prepared. And that's awesome. That's the takeaway I think people need to have.
And I'll say this, if everybody could be fired from their job unexpectedly, take a year off, and then go back to their job again, how much better they would be remarkable. It's something obviously in life, it just doesn't really happen, and get paid. Obviously, that's another part of that was good for my situation. So if that could I would wish that on a lot of people, because of, again, I've lived with it now, and I know what I know the positive impact it can have.
Yeah. And I would even say I was able to take a year off from coaching to try to pour a little more attention into my children. And that year I spent off was the same thing that you got. And then I got back in and it was like, whoa, I have all this whole new toolbox that I didn't have because I was able to remove myself from the grind. So even just taking a beat and putting it down for a little bit, which you never do at your level, is helpful. All right. So let's pivot from there. And this is a question that I've been playing with that it's just interesting, especially as a parent. And I heard this on a bike ride and I got home and asked my wife and my daughter, and it doesn't even have to be basketball related, Rob, but what is something that you have most recently changed your mind on?
That's a really, really good question.
That's why I ran home and shared it with my people. I was like, oh, we got to think about this one.
So let me answer it this way. It might not be specific, but I started this year off a GA leadership group. Okay. It was a grad for GAs in college basketball. And we did Zooms, and I did it through this organization, Top Connect. It was phenomenal. Okay. And it was a chance for me to give back. Mm-hmm. And on the first Zoom, I asked all of these GAs, give me your favorite quote or your favorite saying. And ironically, one of the GAs from Maryland, was on there. And he gave this quote that he said, on the other side of fear are the greatest things in life. Mm-hmm. And I think it struck me to the core. And it's something I've used since that moment, a lot of times. And I think I lived like a lot of college coaches at high levels. You live with the pressures and the fear in the back of your mind of being fired someday. Mm-hmm. And not to belabor the point, because we just spoke about it a little bit, but I think that quote is so true that, on the other side of fear are the greatest things in life. And that can apply to so many different things, your relationship, your job, coaching. So I don't know if it's something I've changed my mind on, but it's something that's kind of been a revelation for me. And it's a great quote that I really feel strongly about now.
Yeah, 100%. I love that. And actually, Jamie Foxx was talking about that on an interview with Tim Ferriss. It was just the same idea. What's on the other side of fear? And that's the thing that you got to get over. And it speaks back to the authenticity of finding yourself, because you can't do that if you're afraid of what it might look like to so-and-so, right? And that's huge. It all ties together. So it's really interesting the way all of this kind of is connected throughout your journey. All right, theoretical last question. If you were starting over today, what advice would you give your younger self? And I've asked, what would you do differently? But most people are like, nothing. It's perfect. It worked out. This is how I've become who I am. But what advice would you give young Rob to get to the point where you've now had this year off and you've had this awakening, so to speak? How would you help your younger self get there quicker?
Yeah. So I spoke a little bit earlier. We talked about being intentional with my time, slowing down, if you will, prioritizing things that are important, don't sweating the small stuff. I think I never really knew also the truth of my definition of discipline in my own life. And I think I would be, being extremely disciplined with trying to be the best version of myself. So I think one thing that I had an assistant coach call me at a prominent school this year and said, hey, my boss, my head coach, I won't say the name, just asked me, he wanted to know what he could do better. He asked the whole staff, what can I do better? And he said, what do you think I should say, Rob? And I said, and this is in February when the stakes are high and you're playing for the NCAA tournament. And I said, he needs to tell him that he needs to do whatever he needs to do to be the best version of himself in the most critical moments. That might mean you don't come into work on Monday because you don't have practice and you spend all day with your kids. That might mean going and playing 18 holes of golf. That might mean watching 15 straight hours of film. That might mean working out every day. That might mean journaling every day. But being able to discover that, I think, is one of the most critical things of leadership. And I think it was, when I look back to times when we did struggle at UAB, I think I was so caught up in the pressures and the stress of the job and wasn't able to step back and be the best version of myself. And I think I learned how to do that at the end of the seasons, which was why we became really good at late February, March, my last 2 years at UAB, winning 5 of 7 and 6 of 8 to close the year out. But at different points in the time, I didn't understand that concept. And I think that's a part of the not really knowing what discipline meant to me, and discipline with my daily habits, pretty much, essentially.
Yeah, no. Again, it's always fascinating when you get an opportunity to think about what you would do, or what lessons you would offer yourself if you had the time machine, right? And the nice thing is you get to start over every day if you want, and you get to apply those things. And so I said that was going to be the last question, but you said something that made me think back to an earlier comment about mentorship and cultivating, kind of your personal board of directors, and that you hadn't done that, even though you had the resources to do it. And so what I'm sitting here with is, are there things that you can offer as we close? Because you've been around some really smart people that have stuck with you, that you take with you. Coach Williams had this imprint, and this is what I try to pay forward. Or because of this year, and I've been intentional about surrounding myself with really good leaders, this is a takeaway. Are there a couple of nuggets you can give that you would like to maybe embed in your own children vicariously, since they don't really listen to us?
Yeah. So, I think there's two things. I think the one thing I touched on, this is a kind of a cool story, but I become friendly and listen to the Ryan Hawk Learning Leader podcast. And, on one of his, he interviewed a guy who's one of the most successful restaurant owners in the world. Okay. And the guy said at a young age, his father installed in him this theory that, what would you attempt to do if you knew you could not fail? Mm-hmm. So I took that quote. I bought I went on Shutterfly about a month ago. I get a picture of my daughter and my son running on the beach, chasing like a bird, like just my wife took a picture, and I put on the bottom and I make it a poster and I put it in my daughter's room. She's 7 years old. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I just love that concept, right? Because, and I'm going to tie that to what you said about mentors. All of us, no matter how successful you are, no matter what stage you are in your life professionally, we all need mentors. And one thing that I've kind of learned over this last year is, when you listen to great leaders on podcasts, or you read, they always are referencing, I learned this from my mentor, or my mentor told me this. And I think there is as strong competitive men, it's awkwardish at times to reach out to someone who maybe is a friend, say, hey, would you be my mentor? Could we set up time every 2 months to talk? Mm-hmm. But I never had a personal board of directors, as you just said it perfectly, to help me be the CEO of UAB basketball. Mm-hmm. And I think that is one of the biggest commonalities for coaches, especially first-time coaches. They don't have that. And sometimes they have a lot of people around them. And when something goes wrong, they'll pick up the phone and call one of their former bosses. But being proactive and seeking advice and wisdom from people, successful, it's an incredibly powerful tool. And this, Coach, almost anybody or that reaches out to you, that picks up the phone and says, Coach, hey man, would you be willing to talk to me for 15 minutes every 2 months? Nobody almost will ever say no. Right. But there's a fear, of doing that, and there's a vulnerability of doing that. And all of us, no matter how successful you are, need people around us to make you successful. That's the name of the game. And so that's kind of my last lines, I guess.
Yeah. Well, to that point, and Brandon said this on his episode, right? And you played with Brandon. So it's like, and he stole it, which we all do, but there's no courage without vulnerability, right? And so it's like, how are you going to risk not being rejected? Because like you said, most people are going to say yes, but acknowledge that you need help. That's the hard thing. And reaching out and asking them. And then the other piece, right? How do you get people with different opinions so that you can listen to each of them and then find your truth? Because if they all have the same opinion, you only need one. You don't need them all. And so it's like, how do you diversify that group? And I think that's the key. And it sounds like you've started to do that, which is awesome. And you'll be able to utilize that on the next steps of your journey. So thanks for being here. Appreciate it. Calling in from East Coast time block. And it's got to be super late there since it's 7:30 here.
Appreciate you, Coach. Thank you.